Welcome back to Steak Bites, where we carve out space for meaningful conversations that go beyond the grill. I'm Kara Smith, your host and fellow enthusiast for all things tasteful and fulfilling. Today, we're diving into an issue that impacts every one of us: how politics and policy impacts our food system. From trade laws to labeling requirements, government decisions shape on what we grow, how we raise it, and what ultimately ends up in your kitchens. Today, joining me is Katharine Lotspeich, whose experience spans from growing up on a large dairy farm to working in the legislature, and now leading the U.S. strategy for an AgriTech company. She brings a unique perspective to how food producers, policymakers, and consumers impact in the interaction and why that matters for all of us. Let's get into it. Welcome, Katharine.
Thanks, Kara. Really excited to be here.
Yeah, thanks for hopping on and joining on a topic of conversation that impacts all of us. Yeah, I really did not get too far into the weeds of policy and politics, and there was so much of frankly my upbringing that we kind of stayed away from that. It was we were a part of the system, but we didn't get down into the weeds of how this truly impacts how we produce food. And then you think about it from a consumer perspective of how this policy really impacts what ends up on our tables. Or, for example, in our kids' classrooms. That's something that just now, both of us kind of being on the front end of the journey of children, I didn't realize what an impact that made. And, since the election, of course, that's been a heavy topic of conversation on the regulatory side of, we think about the food pyramid, the food guidelines, what's really being dictated from the policy and the politics and interaction with the politics side to what actually can end up on our tables. So let's jump into a little bit of your background first and how you move from a large scale dairy farm into some of the policy side and now into the private sector working within the AgriTech side.
Yeah, definitely. So, you lined it up perfectly there. What may be the intention of a policy and what the outcome is when it finally ends up on our dinner table is, two wildly different beasts. And that's, coming from, I did grow up on a large dairy. While I was growing up, we're milking about 2,000 cows. They since expanded since then. So that provided a lot of opportunities to understand, obviously, production. We lived and worked on the farm my entire growing up time, and my family still lives and works on the farm. My parents were very involved, in local, state, and national organizations that supported the industry, and have the leadership tendencies and capabilities that, got them interested in shaping policy for the betterment of the industry. And then, sort of building out of that, I have this, terrible disease of being interested in politics, particularly as it relates to agriculture. And, I'm fortunate that the people around me indulge that and, listen to my perspective, and a lot of really good conversations come out of it. And you and I, in the 7 or 8 years that we have known each other, have had some really cool conversations because we have wildly different perspectives and different experiences and levels of experience and engagement in it. I got my degree in dairy science and also a minor in political science, and had the opportunity to work in the legislature, both in Utah and in Colorado. And that was a really, really interesting complement to what I know happens and how day-to-day experiences are lived and how reality plays out on an agricultural operation. Because Capitol Hill is that's not where it starts, right? Where policy is produced, essentially. Someone has an idea, they have an agenda, they have a hope or a wish or a mandate for change. Whether or not that agenda and change lines up with what you want to happen may or may not be true. But someone has an idea, they want something to change, and so they bring forward, a bill to enact that change. goes through the legislative process. It probably doesn't look a whole lot like what you started out with in the beginning. And then if it gets passed through the legislature, then it has to, so then it's turned into policy, right? Politics turns into policy. And then what needs to happen is it turns into regulations. How do we actually enact this? And the intention of a policy and what gets put into regulation can also look entirely different much of the time. And then you get into semantics and language and interpretation and all that sort of stuff, and that can drive it in an entirely different direction. So then you have you've got regulations, and then there's the implementation. And that again comes down to translation. And how is it translated by the people who are implementing it? And in this case, bureaucrats, right? Upon whoever the receiving end is. And we'll use agricultural producers or consumers here for this purpose, right? And how it's implemented and translated by both parties will often differ. And implementation also depends on day-to-day realities, right? It sounds really good that you, for example, need to be capturing cow emissions to be able to, reduce greenhouse gases or whatever the issue du jour is. But think about trying to do that on a large scale every single day for 5,000 cows. The intention is great. Implementation probably takes a lot different road and journey to get to where you want to be. So what someone starts out with in the beginning, what ends up at the very end probably doesn't look a whole lot the same, from soup to nuts. And that was a really cool opportunity that I got to have. So production practices growing up, got to work on Capitol Hill in politics and policy. My role previous to this was I was working with dairymen and feedlot operators to manage their waste streams and, the environmental regulations that they had to deal with sort of ran interference for them and taking away their pain points. And so I got to see how policy was implemented, how regulations were implemented. So that's given me, I think, a really unique opportunity to be able to see the process from many different points. And, coming back to the family and consumer part of it, like you said, you and I have had a lot of discussions, both before and after we've had children, of how what sounds good translates into an entirely different thing that ends up on your dinner table, on your kids' school lunch table. The food pyramid is a really great example. Now it's called My Plate or My Food Plate. It changed 10 or 15 years ago, but still, industry, nutrition, politics, regulators, interested stakeholders all came together and they had to hash out something that they thought was in the best interest of the country in terms of health outcomes and, a structured way of eating. At least based on the outcomes of pursuing the food pyramid for 50 years, I think that we could have an interesting conversation about how a good intention turned into a pretty bad outcome. So, that's kind of my background and experience of where I put the lens on these kinds of issues.
Yeah, I think that's great to understand both sides of that. Where it started, how it started, and then, as you mentioned, sometimes the lack of implementation. Let's talk from an ag producer perspective and from a consumer perspective. So, as an ag producer, we're cattle producers, we're beef producers, coming from a dairy background. Like, what would you tell an ag producer as far as like how to be involved? Like, what's the best way for you to be a part of the conversation, especially if you're not on Capitol Hill? And the same as that goes for a consumer of how do you be a part of this conversation, have your voice heard, be able to help drive some of these initiatives forward versus, truly being in the legislative process?
Yeah, those are great questions. They're perennial questions. And I'll give my perspective on it. Honestly, I hope that there's some more effective ways that industry and consumers could come around or come together to get our messages across. So let's start with producers, right? The best way the best way to do it is to organize amongst ourselves. Get a group of like-minded people who have the same goals, same end goal to achieve whatever the outcome is, and come together, get a position together, unite, and present a unified front to the people who are making the policy, which in this case are the legislators, right? So it's getting involved locally, and then bringing together your ideas in a coherent way to your representative on Capitol Hill, your state representative, your senator, doing the same on the federal level, right? It is truly making sure that you are at the table. We like to say in the industry, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And it's the truth, because I think, there's been a lot of food policy, agricultural policy made by people who don't actually produce food, right? And so making sure that we're in front of the people who have the votes to make these happen is really, really important. It's a challenge in agriculture because we tend to be, we're obviously rural based. We don't really like, sticking our noses out beyond our day-to-day operations. We want to milk cows, or we want to move cattle, or we want to farm crops, and we just want to stick in our wheelhouse and do what we do and enjoy what we're doing. But you do have to get out of your comfort zone a little bit and, pursue what you think is best for you, your operation, your family, and your industry together. It's another adage that if you don't vote, you can't complain. So you need to be involved to enact and catalyze the kind of change that you want to see. Coming at it from the consumer perspective, I think that that's not the only way in agriculture. That's just the biggest and best way at the moment. Coming to it from a consumer perspective, I think there's some more fun opportunities to collaborate, because if producers are talking to consumers, the people who buy our food every single day, the ones that we rely on to stay in business, I think that there's really cool options there for just straight up communication, talking to each other, right? Growing up in the industry, it felt like, especially in the late 2010s or late 2000s, early 2010s, there was always the conversation around the consumer. How do we educate the consumer? How do we engage the consumer? How do we get them on our side? And I think it always felt like a very tension-filled conversation, and I don't think that it has to be. I think what's lacking here is producers reaching a hand out and saying, "Hey, let's talk." And I think that that's something that you and your family in Colorado Craft Beef have done a really, really great job of, is not just starting the conversation, but encouraging and building the conversation and pulling people into what you do every single day. And so it's honestly, I think it's producers having the courage to talk to consumers and put themselves out there. And then, curiosity on the part of consumers. And, that has come into play a lot in the last 10 or 15 years, is people want to know where their food comes from. They want to know how it's grown. They want to know what's behind the labeling on it. And who better to tell that story and tell the truth about it than producers? So, if producers and consumers can come together and find common ground, and they have, common issues or things that they want to address, taking that coalition then to Capitol Hill, to the legislature, or even to local organizations, like the cattlemen's, who can take that message to Capitol Hill, or a PTA committee, and you can take what you want to have happen in your local school district food system. Organizing on that level between two interested parties, I think, can be a really, really powerful way to approach building a relationship to create change.
Yeah, I agree. Those conversations are great to be had. And that was one of the things when we started this endeavor, was looking at that really a massive disconnect of how food was produced with, the consumption side of it. And of course, we can put policymakers in the middle of that. We can put it, whatever you'd like to, in that entire chain. But it's like that chain was not tied together. There was such a disconnect, which leaves room for distrust. It leaves room for questions. It leaves room for somebody to come in with, frankly, misinformation and misguide. And that I feel like is part of where we have gotten to. But I would love to hear your thoughts on, like, what do you think has led to this disconnection, between policymakers, between food producers and consumers, which, some cases we're one and the same, right? We produce, we consume, but yet it does seem like it's opposite ends of the spectrum. And there's just a little bit of a disconnect in between, which has led to things like some of the changes, in the My Plate or the food pyramid, or recommending highly processed foods over whole foods, and some of kind of the big changes that I would say has happened in this country that in a lot of ways has been led by policy or legislation, or however you want to put that into those terms, because that's what's guiding that. So what do you think is the biggest disconnect there?
So this is, this is such a nuanced question, multi-layered, right? Which is fantastic. This is the kind of stuff that we like to get into.
Yeah, those are my kind of questions for you, Katharine.
Yeah, exactly. Yes or no is not fun. I see this into two not separate but connected buckets. First off is lived experience. Americans are 3 to 4 generations removed from the farm these days, right? And so most Americans, it's 2% or 1% of Americans are involved in production agriculture. That leaves 99% of people in our country, our friends, family, neighbors, who don't have experience on a farm. And the vast majority of those people are the people who represent us, right? So they don't have the lived experience of reality on the farm, or of production practices, of all of the economic factors, the weather factors, the, access factors to, even rural broadband, right? To be able to get the information that you need, get the data that you're gathering to make management decisions, all of the things that go into a day-to-day practice that you and I live and breathe, drought, all of that sort of stuff, are just not things that most Americans are familiar with. And that's not a bad thing, because that shift away from the farm has enabled us to build an incredibly forward-thinking and progressive society, and we have cool things like smartphones and trucks. I don't know how to build those things. I don't want to know how to build them. Somebody got to leave the farm and go learn how to do that. It's fantastic. It benefits all of us. But that means that most of our fellow citizens don't know the realities of on the farm. So, it's just that the people shaping policy don't understand the realities of it. And, in agriculture, again, we are a very, very small minority. We don't tend to be particularly vocal because we just want to, not all of us, but want to stay on the farm and stay in our wheelhouse and, produce food. And so, maybe the lopsidedness of experience is one thing that I see, is that disconnect, right? And then the other is you could call it the pendulum of partisan policy. It seems like every election we swing one way or the other, and each party, each faction has their own priorities. And those priorities can be informed by people who, again, have agendas that may not be in the best interest of American citizens and their health as a whole. It's difficult to make things work in a best practice way when there's inconsistent policy direction. And that can be around, on the production side, water, labor, trade, and then on the nutrition side and for consumers on let's just use the example again of school nutrition policy. The last time that those were revamped, pizza was classified as a vegetable because there was some lobbying group that figured out how to, put that into the language to work that around so that they could have more of their product in a very large government contract, right? And so it can be very much agenda driven, and then depending on which party is in power, which way that agenda is going to go. So those two disconnects, I think, are ones that drive these challenges mainly. And you're absolutely right. Like a lot of the health outcomes that we're seeing are driven by policy. And, you know, you look at the health outcomes in America right now, and it could be easy to think that it was nefarious. I don't think that it was. I mean, hopefully somewhere everyone has a good intention, and just the way that it was put together, the language was enacted, and how it was implemented got lost somewhere along the way. But coming back to how do we fix this? It's talking to each other. And I think that having the two most important stakeholders in this conversation, producers and consumers, is where that change needs to come from. It's going to take a lot of hard work to get there.
Absolutely. So you mentioned quite a few things in that topic of conversation, Catherine, that I think are worth having a conversation around, because this was even something that I didn't realize, with the interaction of policy and legislation, because I definitely have not taken a more, the proactive approach you have to be in that world per se.
Probably because you actually have some sanity left.
I mean, kudos. It really is so nuanced, and worth having the understanding of it, because it really does impact how it's implemented, on the farm, on the ranch, what impacts it has on somebody's plate, and then ultimately the health outcomes of that. Like it does make a massive difference. But to that topic of conversation, I would love for you to touch on the Farm Bill, because I would say that is one that, we don't have to get down in the weeds of that, but I would say, and you correct me if I'm wrong here, but I'd say that's one piece of legislation that has to walk down both sides of the aisle and has impacts both directions: production, consumption, in between. I mean, it has a huge impact. So I'd say that would be one especially massive piece of legislation, that some people may be familiar with, some may not be. So maybe we start there of like, hey, what is this? Why? And then how it's actually came about and how it's actually implemented. Because I would say that is just like such a prime example of this topic of conversation.
You're exactly right. It is a prime example. It's the prime example, I think, of food policy in the United States. And I love how you put that. That bill has to walk down the aisle, in between the two parties to be able to get enacted. Real quick piece of history. I probably won't get it entirely correct, but the Farm Bill came about in the 1930s during the Great Depression, and it was a way both to support farmers operationally, with the financial struggles that they were having and resources, and also to provide food assistance to the majority of Americans who were struggling because the major breadwinners in their families were out of work. And today that has evolved into the Farm Bill as we know it, which still provides farm supports, subsidies. We could get into a whole argument about that sort of stuff, but that's for the ag policy nerds and farmers to fight about. It also provides, funding for scientific studies and all of that sort of thing, all of the sorts of things that you can imagine going to production ag, and to support best practices in that regard. On the other side of it is food assistance, and food assistance falls into several different categories, but this includes things like SNAP program, or EBT, Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, which used to be known as food stamps. It's the school lunch program. It is, providing funds for hospitals and nursing homes and all those sorts of things for people to have access to food. 80% of the Farm Bill is food assistance. And that the way that the Farm Bill gets passed is that those two things go together. If, there's a lot of talk in agriculture about how we need to separate them. If we separated the production stuff versus the food assistance stuff, neither one of them would ever get passed, and all of that assistance would disappear into the ether. So it very much has to walk down the aisle. That is the absolute truth. I love that. So the Farm Bill comes up every 5 years and has to be renewed and, reviewed and all that sort of thing. And a lot of times, nutrition and nutritional guidelines, and what is portioned out to everybody is also reviewed there. And it drives nutritional policy in the United States. Um, like anything else, there's good and bad about it, and there's a lot of opportunity for change and improvement. Um, you know, policy and legislation does not happen fast, and when it comes to a bill this big, it happens even slower. This is often something that gets kicked down the road because there's elections or other bills that are seen to be more more of a priority in the moment, and this just sort of runs in the background. But I think the fact that that happens to the farm bill is really a shame because society has changed so much, and how we know, especially what we know the last 50 years, 50, 70 years of food policy, what we know and what we know about how that affects health outcomes, how it affects people, how it affects our brains, and in turn, how all that affects our society, I think needs to be given more credence and more urgency, quite honestly.
Yeah, I would agree. A quote comes to my mind along that topic of conversation is, a hungry person has one problem.
Love this quote.
We have many because we're well fed. And
Yep.
It's, frankly, a privilege that we have in this country to be able to have the food choices we do and to be able to be as well fed as we are. But that doesn't mean that, we don't need to understand some of the nuances of it, have that more concerted effort around these types of conversations. And, that's part of this podcast, is to try to bring some of these topics of conversation to light. Is like, hey, let's have that conversation around how food is produced, where it comes from, how you're filling your bodies. Like, it's wonderful that we live in such a great country where we get the opportunity to have these types of nuanced conversations because our bellies are full. So
Absolutely.
Go ahead.
Yeah, you're absolutely right about that. And I love that saying. I think about it and I quote it often. Just thinking about it here, I've been hangry plenty of times in my life, right? Like,
me too.
Definitely been hangry. Yeah. You and I, we know about each other. We need some chips and salsa. But I've never truly been hungry. I've never been starving. And that is such a fortunate place to be. And there's plenty of food insecurity in the United States. And that, considering the abundance that we produce and just our technological world that we live in, that's wrong, and it can be addressed. And the political reasons and societal reasons behind it are shameful, frankly. But in general, our society, our country hasn't been hungry in 3 generations, right? Like, not since the Great Depression and the Civil War, World War II.
Right.
And we do get to have these kinds of conversations, and with a full belly, we can give clear-eyed thought to how we can change things for the better. How do you change a society? You change the way that it eats. And I'm thinking about 2 examples here. One is I work for a company that's based in Scotland. So all of my colleagues are Scottish or British mainly, and have really cool conversations with them about agriculture and the food systems between our different countries and the observations and the perspectives. And I was talking to one of my colleagues a few months ago, and he was telling me, you're talking about the British Empire, through the 1600s to the 1800s, and how they truly were the global superpower. And then, in the late 1700s, early 1800s, the empire started to decline. And that was because of the introduction of sugar to the British diet. And these used to be the strongest, most fit fighting force in the world. They started eating an abundance of sugar, and their health went down, and especially their teeth started rotting away. And so they couldn't eat the kind of healthful foods that they were used to before, and they had to rely on more and more processed foods because they're softer and easier to eat, right? And so as the health of the British empire and army went down, so did the decline of that global superpower. So that's one way that society has changed, because of the way that it ate. And unfortunately, these are 2 negative examples. I'm sure that there's positive examples out there. But again, you look at food policy in the United States, since the 50s, and look what has happened. With the introduction of a highly processed diet, our health outcomes they've just tanked, right? And, there's been a lot of emphasis in the last 20 years to move, more towards whole foods. And in the last 10 years, I would say moving towards complete animal proteins, and getting your nutrients from food, not from supplements and all those sorts of things. And so, those are two examples of how a society can decline based on what they eat. But I think we have an opportunity here for change, right? And that's the conversation that we're having right now. What Colorado Craft Beef is doing in your day-to-day work is driving that change, because we can see those examples, but we see the opportunities for improvement.
Yeah, I think that's a great example. And when we think about to the point of, the British Empire, we think about our country. And so much of the thought process of being able to be a superpower is because we can feed our people. And
food security is national security.
Yeah, and that's internal within our country. Is the fact that we can supply food for our country. And to the topic conversation of production, we're very good at ag production, to essentially an excess, to where then trade becomes a topic of conversation, which I actually think is very timely for this, because we can talk about trade and tariffs because of what's going on politically right now within the new administration. But that is a huge indication of an economic superpower, is food security and being able to feed your people.
Yep, that is 1000% the truth. The United States Department of Agriculture was originally founded by Abraham Lincoln, and he knew. I mean, based on, I don't know at what point, if it was right before or during the Civil War, that he built that department, but it was because he knew that food security was national security, and he wanted to make sure that was protected and promoted. And look, here we are, 150 years later, and we have that same goal, and obviously other agencies and organizations to promote it and protect it. But a fed population is a happy population, is a population that can defend itself, right? And you aren't reliant on a trading partner who's going to withhold food because they want something from you, right? Yep. Exactly. So the way that food and health plays into national security is maybe not something that everyone really thinks about or is very obvious, but I think it's sort of like an operating system in the background. It needs to be working for it to work, on the grand scale. It works behind the scenes. You don't really notice it, but when it's not there working, when the updates haven't happened, things can go to hell in a handbasket pretty quickly.
Absolutely. Man, these are just topics that I think we don't take as much time to really dig into, as the American people, especially as you said, we're well fed. So let's think about that from, American agriculture and how we do produce these things internally, which hence can lead us to some of the trade opportunities. I'd love for you to touch a little bit on trade, export, potential tariffs, of course, the tariff conversation in general at a high level where we currently are within, the political conversation. But because there's a few things that I'd like to touch on from the beef industry, but I'd love your perspective too from the dairy industry and, what exports really do mean, what trade means for us in this country as far as not only food security, but the economic advantage that we have as American producers because of what we produce and how we produce it at, frankly, the scale we produce it at.
To go back to what you said a few minutes ago, we are really, really good in United States agriculture at producing food, high quality and abundant food. And that creates food security for us. We create such an abundance that then we have the opportunity to trade it with other countries, which is really, really cool because other countries make things that we don't, that we want. And so we make something that they don't, that they want. We trade it, right? That's how trade works, which I think is super cool. Because I don't know how to make shoes, but I want them. So I would gladly send, some butter across the border so that someone sends me shoes. So that, that's the basis of trade, is that you're good at producing something that someone else wants, and they have something that they're good at producing that you want. United States trade right now, as we all know, is in major flux. I mean, it changes second to second, right? And agricultural producers are obviously watching this very, very closely because we do export a lot of our products. This, I mean, I spend so much time every single day reading a whole lot of articles about trade and the balance of trade and tariffs right now. And, what it looks like today and what it's going to look like in 6 months, we can't even begin to wrap our arms around. The implications of, gosh, I don't even want to go into implications. That's prognosticating, and it's going to be wrong in a week anyway. I think the uncertainty that is being created right now, uncertainty leads to anxiety, and that can upend markets. It can increase inflation quite a bit, which, causes anxiety amongst families trying to feed themselves. It's an uncomfortable place to be right now. One of the really cool things about agricultural trade is that we get food that we don't produce in the United States. Or so I'm thinking especially of produce in the wintertime, right? We can have guacamole in January because Mexico and Chile grow avocados at that time of year, right? We wouldn't be able to do that without them. And in return, we ship milk to Mexico, and I don't know what the heck we trade with Chile, but I'm sure that there's something. I guess without trade, without free trade, we wouldn't be able to have the options that we do have. I'd be eating turnips in January, and I don't really like turnips very much. They aren't as good as guac. And so, I think thinking about how blessed we are to have the abundance and the variety and the options that we have is a very important thing to consider when you're thinking about trade and how it affects, you as a consumer. You and I are consumers too, right? And we've got little people in our house who are very, very big consumers. Boy, can they eat a lot. The size and scope and scale of this trade enables us to have really, really abundant, affordable, and a wide variety of options. And I think that gets forgotten in these conversations, when it becomes a little bit more protectionist. I don't want to get into political views here, but there's a lot more nuance to it than, you give, we get, or we give, you get kind of a thing. And there's a lot of layers behind it that have built the food system and the food supply chain that we have in the United States. And, trade promotes that. And, any number of things is going to happen between now and whenever. And it will be interesting to me. I'm interested to see in a year, what's changed. What is this a net benefit? Net negative for consumers, for producers, for all of us, and the options that we have available to us.
Yeah. You highlighted one thing in there that I think is incredibly important. It's an incredibly important point to drive home, not just, from an ag perspective, but a consumer perspective as well, is that uncertainty. The uncertainty is driving a massive amount of volatility. I mean, I can just speak for the cattle market for a second. Yeah, I don't watch the milk markets because that's not, my world, but I'm sure you can touch on that. I mean, the fluctuation that we've seen in the cattle markets has been due to uncertainty. Yeah, and then you start following the funds and like some of the other dynamics that we typically don't think about, and you definitely don't think about from a consumer perspective, when you're buying a steak. But that massive amount of uncertainty is driving a massive amount of market fluctuation as well. And people being uncertain about where their food potentially comes from, that's not a good place to be. I mean, I can speak for myself for a second. Yeah, I imagine you were probably in a similar place, Katharine. In COVID, I had a 3-month-old baby, but the fact that, I knew that I had an entire freezer full of beef to be able to feed myself and my family in an incredibly uncertain time. I mean, the mental space that I was able to be in because of that was incredible. I look back on it now and I'm like, wow, that was definitely something to be said. And we had so many people calling the beef company of like, hey, how do I get beef? Because I'm standing here at Costco and there's nothing to be had. And I need to be able to feed myself. And that thought process of that food insecurity, for us personally, and I'm talking, CCB as a whole, but, even if I was just talking about my family, but talking about CCB, that was part of why we put the supply chain together that we did, because there is a lot of uncertainty in the cattle supply chain. And there's even more when you move to the beef side, because you start having, 4 large packers in control of kind of your destiny, and you're a price taker no matter what. When you function in the commodity beef, commodity cattle business, unless you have some sort of a value proposition, you're a price taker. You do not have control of your own destiny. So how else do you do that besides, secure your own supply chain, I guess, and take control of your own destiny, which is the beauty of living in this country. And we are able to do that, which is pretty cool. Not many other countries could say that or have the ability to be able to put that together. And I feel blessed that we're able to do that. But man, that uncertainty is something that is a big thing, but it's even a bigger thing when it's something that's as emotionally connected as food.
You're absolutely right. You absolutely nailed it on the head on all of those points. The uncertainty is, it creates chaos, it creates anxiety. And to go back to the volatility you were talking about, we've seen the same thing in dairy markets. Towards the end of 2024, we were looking at dairy prices of $22 a hundredweight for milk. Cost of production right around 2021. So there's a little bit of room for profit there, right? I looked at milk prices a couple of days ago when Liberation Day was announced. They had crashed to $16 a hundredweight. That is $6 below what needs to happen just to cover cost of production. Going back to exports and trade, the dairy industry in the last 20 years, our export market has been anywhere between 5 and 10% of annual production in the United States dairy industry. You get that uncertainty in there, and markets crash like that, and all of a sudden your market is flooded with 5 to 10% of product that you aren't expecting. That it can be a good thing on prices for consumers, but you look at what that does to an industry, right? That decimates an already small and very consolidated industry. And what does that do for food security when things start to bounce back? Because all of those people have been driven out of business because of volatility and chaos and uncertainty. That's a really scary thing to think about. And, coming back to what CCB has done with building your own supply chain, I think is a really, really great way to mitigate that risk and volatility, just like you just described, and to take control of your own destiny, and ensure that you are still here producing food for your family and your community. And, that you highlighted too, the just-in-time supply chain that we have in the United States, and that was very nearly broken by COVID. My family and I have a freezer full of beef too, and we're really, really grateful for it. And we had it during COVID, and that was a huge, huge comfort. But not everybody has that ability. Not everybody lives on land like we do. Not everyone, has freezer space. Maybe someone's living in a high-rise apartment in New York City, and they just don't have those opportunities. And so finding ways to do that for the communities around us, I think is really, really important. And also looking back at it, to come back to policy, and regulation, how do we start to fill those gaps in a supply chain that has been optimized for just in time, for maximum efficiency and profitability, right? We saw it nearly broken during COVID, and it was scary. But quite honestly, I don't think that we as an industry across the supply chain took it seriously enough. And when there's a next event like COVID or whatever it is it truly going to break? Are we going to get hungry? We are 3 meals away from eating each other.
Yeah, that's fair. It's definitely something to consider. Because I think a lot of us have a little bit of a short-term memory, and that is the reality of it. So taking time to have these types of conversations and just further nurture that thought, I think is a good step in the right direction. But to the policy perspective, I'd love to hear your thoughts on one major food policy that you would like to see changed.
I would go back to the nutrition guidelines. you know, as I understand it, the nutrition guideline panel who developed the nutrition guidelines, and I think the nutrition guidelines are supposed to be revisited every 10 years, and they're coming up for a review. As I understand it, that panel is made up of people who stand to profit from getting the most of their product into the nutritional guidelines. You know, people from food companies, you know, people selling supplements, you know, someone who has a vested interest in selling more of XYZ. You know, I think that the primary people on that panel need to be food producers. So a beef producer, a crop producer, a vegetable producer, a fruit producer, you know, fisheries, you know, people who actually produce real raw food, not potato chips. And then mothers, people who teach small people who understand what the brain needs to grow and develop into a big, strong, healthy, creative, innovative, hardworking individual, you know, to promote and protect our society and our country. I think if you take the people who produce the food and the people who feed the food to little people, so mothers, parents, you know, those kind of people, I think, who have an honest and clear-eyed look at what nutrition can and actually needs to do for our society, starting with our children, is what needs to happen. And so it's not quite an answer to policy, but it's an answer to how the policy is built. Is I think that the people on the nutrition panel right now are too stuck in, you know, ways that they can profit for themselves, to the detriment of our society, if I'm being quite frank.
I think that's a great thought process with that. You know, not necessarily like, hey, what policy you can change, but frankly, how? And one thing is you're going through all of, you know, kind of the people to have at the table. And this is even more of a shift that we've continued to experience of a lot of the people within our community, but you hear more of these conversations every day too, is healthcare professionals. And
Yes.
So many more healthcare professionals have moved away from actual practice because they're band-aiding the issues. They're treating the issues. They're not actually getting to the core of the health issues that we're seeing in this country. And seeing that type of like grassroots movement of so many more health professionals away from that and having the nutrition conversations, having the how you fuel your body, whole foods, the, you know, just thinking about how we can be, you know, just more, you know, healthier humans is pretty incredible. It's also kind of scary that we've gotten to this point, but that's a different topic of conversation for a different day. And I would say I was just as guilty as everybody else before I had kids, of not really putting as much thought into health and nutrition as I really probably should have. Like, there just wasn't as much of that like cognizant thought of what you put in your body. And then you're fueling a tiny body and you're like, oh man, let's think about this. And it's so counterintuitive because I'm a trained ruminant nutritionist. I'm a cow nutritionist. Like, we think a lot about what we put in the bodies of our animals. Like, I mean, we have
to get the best outcomes.
Absolutely. We have full on rations. Like, we're meeting protein, we're meeting energy, we're meeting all of, you know, the micronutrients. Like, it's a science that has been studied, and there's PhDs and years of research that goes into this. And the beauty about the animal side, beauty or, you know, nuance, I guess, is it truly can be studied a little more than humans, because they're destined for our food chain, right? So the study that goes into the animal side of the nutrition piece and the health component that interfaces with that is very far and vast. So when we start translating some of that, I think some people may get offended when I, you know, correlate cows to humans. You know, I'm like, well, we're mammals, but you know, there are some thought processes though that we really focus on when it comes to animal production from nutrition, health, that interface. Like that's what I spent the majority of my undergrad and my graduate career on, was the interface between health and nutrition. And we finally now have seen human health try to catch up to that, and we're having more of these conversations. So it's a good time to be able to be a part of that, and talk about the value of high quality proteins and how they fuel people's bodies.
Again, you were right about all of that, and it's funny because we do feed our animals to optimize performance, health of the animal, and at the end, profitability, right? I mean, that's why we're in business. Obviously, you can't do that on humans, although you could make the argument that that has happened in the last 50 or 70 years. And that, again, that's a whole entire conversation for another day. But, we've highlighted some of the challenges here, some things, if you look at them in the wrong way, could be viewed negatively. But what you just said about we're able to be here and have the conversation, I think is a really, really exciting time to be a human, right? To produce beef, to have these conversations, to be part of the supply chain, to be part of a community who wants to do better for itself. There's plenty of challenges, but the opportunities are exciting, to be able to be a part of positive change that can do nothing but good for everyone. I mean, that's a pretty cool place to be as humans, right? We can take that and run with it and do something really, really cool.
Yeah, it is. And speaking, from us both being mothers of younger children too, man, I am glad that we're having this conversation now, not when they're 12 or 15, or, we're really considering those things and how they have impacts, not only on their current state, but their future. Like nutrition is huge to that piece of that. Like how we're fueling their bodies now is shaping their future in so many forms or facets.
It absolutely is, and I think, especially when you look at it from a whole protein perspective, a complete protein perspective, it was protein that grew us into Homo sapiens, right? And so to be able to be the best Homo sapiens that we have, let's use that protein at the very beginning of those little lives and grow them into the absolute biggest potential that they have to be.
Absolutely. Well, Katharine, I'd love to hear some closing thoughts. I'd love for you to share with our listeners on where they can find you to have some additional conversations and seek some more insights.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Kara. First off, it's been a pleasure to be here. This has been a lot of fun. So thank you for the invitation. Closing thoughts, I think the importance of these conversations cannot be understated. It's really cool that you and I are having it, producer to producer, cow nerd to cow nerd. And then, the audience that you're bringing this to is your stakeholders and people who buy your product and, buy into your mission and your vision for Colorado craft beef. And keeping these conversations alive and having the courage to start them and to go into the hard places and talk about the nuances and all of the gray areas, I think is key to driving the kind of change that we're talking about here. It's not easy. It takes a lot of time. It can be challenging. There's all kinds of different perspectives, and keeping respect in the conversation is paramount and difficult. But, staying laser focused on doing these hard things, I think is how we get to the best place possible for everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to share about where people can find me. I am a co-host of the Millennial Ag podcast. And listeners, you should go back and find Kara's episode. She's joined us a couple of times as well to have cool conversations like this. Millennialag.com. You can find us, just search Millennial Ag on any of your favorite podcast platforms. We're on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, and LinkedIn. So any of the platforms you can find us, just look for Millennial Ag. We like to have conversations like this as well. And just grateful for the opportunity to talk about this kind of stuff, Kara. So thank you.
Perfect. You bet. Love having insightful conversations. And yeah, as you mentioned, we all can do hard things. I have to remind my 3 and 5-year-old that every day, trying to tie our shoes. Like, man, we can do hard things. You can do it. So,
you can do it.
Yes.
You can do it. Yep.
Thanks again, Katharine. So as we wrap up today's episode, I want to thank Katharine Lotspeich for sharing her expertise and shedding light on how politics and food intersect. It's clear that policy decisions don't just impact farmers and ranchers. They impact every single one of us. So if you found today's conversation insightful, be sure to subscribe, leave a review, share this episode with others that care about where their food comes from. Stay inspired, stay intentional, and keep fueling your legacy. Till next time, thank you for tuning in to Steak Bites.